Story 1. I worked as an IT specialist for the Canadian Armed Forces, TAF. While my job required more travel than most people in my industry, it wasn't particularly exciting. This story begins in 2011, around the time Windows 7 was released. Big organizations, including the CAF, were upgrading their computer systems from the older Windows XP to the new Intel Core processors. Most of my work involved dealing with computers used by regular staff, not the specialized servers with sensitive military data. My job was similar to IT work done in big companies or universities, just in military settings. Some CAF locations were modern and bustling, while others were older and more remote. One assignment took me to a remote area in interior British Columbia. There were 8 buildings serving a general surveillance radar station with about 30 staff members. The place seemed to have been built in the 1950s. There was only one road, and the area was surrounded by forest. It was a very quiet place. I had to drive there from Vancouver, which took about 8 hours. Despite the beautiful natural scenery, the drive felt long and monotonous. The town near the base was dull, and my opinion didn't change even after staying at the local hotel and arriving at the base the next morning. Upon arrival, I met a senior tech I knew. He informed me that he would be leaving soon and that his work there was done. He had ordered new hardware, which would arrive by the end of the week. This news frustrated me because it was only Monday, and it meant I had to spend the week decommissioning old computers, piling them up, and preparing them for shipment. Usually, we replaced old computers while setting up new ones to minimize downtime, but this time, the radar system was also being upgraded, so we had more flexibility. I was left alone to do this work. The senior tech had to leave, but I wasn't entirely alone for the whole week. A specialized database administrator named Mary would arrive later to help with the database migration. Until she arrived, I had to follow the tasks assigned to me. The senior tech gave me a security card, some documents and labels for the pallets. It felt strange being alone without familiar colleagues. I had always worked with team members I knew. Now, I had to work with someone I had never met before. My first task was to unbox the new server hardware, which had already arrived. I had to go to another building that connected to the radar equipment. It was smaller than the others. Inside, I found boxes of new equipment, including Hewlett-Packard servers and networking devices. Some of the boxes were already opened, which I assumed was done by the senior tech before he left. And so began my week at the quiet, remote radar station, preparing it for the next phase of its technological upgrade. The atmosphere was serene, and I found myself adjusting to the solitude. It was an unusual experience to be the only IT personnel on site, responsible for a significant upgrade, but it was also an opportunity to prove my capabilities. With each day, I went through the old computers, carefully decommissioning them, labeling them, and stacking them on pallets. It was a meticulous process, and I took my time to ensure everything was done correctly. The quiet surroundings helped me focus on my work, but there was also a sense of isolation that made me appreciate the presence of my colleagues in previous assignments. As the week progressed, I began to anticipate Mary's arrival. The idea of working with someone new was both exciting and nerve-wracking. I wondered what she would be like and how we would collaborate on this important project. Finally, the day came when Mary arrived at the base. Mary was experienced and had a calm demeanor that put me at ease. She quickly assessed the situation, and we began working together to set up the new database system. Her expertise in database management was evident, and I learned a lot from her during our time together. We developed a good working relationship, and the project moved along smoothly. By the end of the week, we had successfully upgraded the radar station's computer systems. The new hardware was installed, and the database migration was complete. I felt a sense of accomplishment as we finished the job. It had been a unique experience, working in such a remote and quiet location, and it taught me a lot about adaptability and teamwork. Reflecting on the experience, I realized that even the most seemingly mundane assignments could offer valuable lessons and unexpected opportunities. Working with Mary and handling the responsibilities on my own had given me a new perspective on my role in the CAF and the importance of being prepared for any situation. A few more steps in, I started to hear the loud noise of a fan from the room next door. The sound was constant and almost felt like it was vibrating through the walls. Curious, I decided to investigate. I walked over to the door and tried to enter. To my surprise, the door was locked. I pulled out my swipe card, a simple magnetic strip card that you use on the embedded readers, and tried to unlock the door. The reader beeped, but the door didn't open. Apparently, I hadn't been authorized to access that room. I felt a bit puzzled and frustrated, wondering why I couldn't enter. Feeling a bit determined to figure out what was going on, I knocked on the door, even though I thought no one else was supposed to be there. To my surprise, I saw someone move behind the small glass window on the door. They came over and opened it. The noise from the fan immediately filled the air, making it hard to hear anything else. The woman who opened the door quickly ushered me back out, closing the door behind us to reduce the noise. The woman introduced herself as Mary. She was not at all what I was expecting. She was pretty, probably in her early 30s, with brown hair. I was wearing my work uniform, but she was dressed in a comfortable blouse and skirt that looked both professional and casual. She was friendly at first and was carrying an old leather-bound notebook. I asked her about the server boxes around us and why they had arrived before the other computers. She explained that these were different from the standard computers coming later, and that she had already started working on them. I offered to help her set them up, as I didn't know much about the operating systems or database software we would be using. Then something strange happened. Mary suddenly froze and bent over as if she was about to be sick. I quickly bent down to check if she was all right, and she began to dry heave. It was really odd to watch. She lay down on her stomach on the floor, heaved again, and coughed loudly. After a few moments, she got up and looked at me with a neutral expression on her face. She paused for a few seconds, then smiled and said I could help her, but only if she was in the server room with me. She swiped her card, and we entered the room together. I kept asking if she was okay, but she ignored me and continued working. It was strange, but I decided not to push further. Inside the server room, there was a desk with 2 large server racks on top, already powered on. These weren't making the loud fan noise, though. Beyond the desk, there was a maze of tall server racks, almost like a cornfield, with narrow paths between them. The room was very cold, probably because of the air conditioning. Although the noise from the fans wasn't as loud as I initially thought, it was still quite oppressive. The cold air seemed to cut through my clothes, making me shiver a little. I asked Mary what all the devices were for, and she said she didn't know everything about them. She mentioned that one of the devices ran an old database, and she was migrating the data to new hardware. We had to set it up first. At the far end of the maze, there was an empty rack where the new servers would go. These servers were heavy, and I suggested using a cart to move them. However, Mary insisted that we use her rolling chair instead. I realized then that she was a bit quirky. I placed the server on the chair and carefully wheeled it over, making sure Mary approved of every step. The chair wobbled a bit under the weight, but we managed to get the server over to the rack without any mishaps. We connected the power and network cables, and the setup was done quickly. Mary needed to configure the networking devices on her desk before installing them. I decided to wait and watch, hoping to learn something new. However, Mary told me I could leave and that she would be fine on her own. I insisted on staying, saying it was no trouble. That's when she suddenly snapped at me. She stood up, waved her hand, and told me loudly to go away. It was almost as if she was talking to an animal. She dropped her notebook, and when I tried to pick it up, she grabbed it aggressively from me. She then walked around her desk, clutching her notebook tightly to her chest with both arms, and watched me leave. It was incredibly bizarre. I felt very confused and wondered what I had done wrong. Mary had been friendly before, so her sudden change in behavior was surprising. I tried to calm down and thought that maybe she was under a lot of stress or feeling unwell. I decided to give her the benefit of the doubt. I continued with my work, trying to figure out where I would eat lunch and relax during breaks. There were usually computer labs where I could play video games, but not here. Every computer was being replaced. I suddenly remembered that I had left my lunch bag in the server room with Mary. By then, I was working in a different building on the upper floor. I was in the process of removing a computer from its cage when I turned around and saw Mary. She was smiling at me, looking friendly again. Mary dropped my leather bag on the floor without saying anything, and then walked away. I could hear the sound of her heels clicking down the hall. I had no idea how she found me or why she brought my bag. It was all very confusing. As I stood there, I couldn't help but wonder what her deal was and why she had acted so strangely. Anyway, I was really creeped out. I was sure she didn't like me. The way she smiled and just dropped my bag on the ground felt so cold. It was weird how she followed me, and I wondered how she did it. Maybe we were the only 2 people in the building at that time, except for some radar techs who might have been around. I started to mentally prepare for a week with a strange temporary boss. Things went normally as I worked alone. I stacked old computers onto pallets, making sure to remove any storage drives first. These drives had military data on them, so I needed to dispose of them securely. We had a special machine for this called a degaussing machine, which used a strong magnet to destroy the data. Each site had one. It was about the size of a microwave, and you would put a drive in it and listen to it make funny noises. I filled a box with used hard drives and headed to the degaussing machine, which was not in Mary's building, but in the first one I had entered that day. When I got there, carrying my big box of drives, I noticed the machine was already on. This was strange because it was a simple task that Mary would have asked me to do if it needed to be done. The process for an HDD only took about 2 minutes, and yet I hadn't seen anyone leave the area. There was no one there now. I waited a bit until the machine stopped. I slowly opened the tray, expecting to find a hard drive inside, but there was no drive. At first, I didn't think much of it. Then I noticed a small black ring against the dark tray. I picked it up, and it was hot to the touch, which wasn't normal for this machine. Even weirder, there was a strange smell in the air, like metal and ozone, almost like the smell before a thunderstorm. The sky was clear, so it didn't make sense. Trying not to worry too much, I put the ring in my pocket, deciding to ask Mary about it later if I could find the courage. I started degaussing my batch of hard drives. No one came by while I was doing this. The machine worked fine, but the ozone smell lingered the whole time. It was still there when I left. The end of the day came quickly. I timidly made my way to Mary's server room. I knocked on the door I had knocked on earlier and saw that the small LED on the access panel was green, meaning it was unlocked. I entered the room and saw no one at the desk. There was a laptop connected to a networking switch with a cable, and the terminal still displayed a generic welcome message. It seemed Mary hadn't started configuring it for the new infrastructure even after almost 8 hours. I didn't see Mary anywhere until I looked into the maze of servers. I spotted her through the gaps in the racks and appliances. I moved closer, calling out to her as politely as I could to avoid upsetting her again. She didn't respond, so I got a little closer. Despite the noise from the fans, I knew she could hear me. As I stepped into the maze, it got quieter. She was just standing there, staring at a server rack that appeared to be off. It was old hardware that I couldn't identify, and she seemed mesmerized by it. I called her name once, then twice. Both scared of her reaction and worried about her, I tapped her on the shoulder. She didn't whip around like I expected. Instead, she slowly turned to look at me. An air vent from one of the other racks blew strands of her hair into her face. She looked tired and distant, still clutching her notebook. After a few seconds, she blinked and seemed to snap out of it. She corrected her posture, shook her head quickly, and smiled at me. She greeted me and asked what I was doing there. I blinked and asked if she was all right. I had an itchy feeling across my skin that was hard to explain. It was just unbearable. I felt like I had to leave, but didn't know why. Mary hurriedly moved past me, out of the maze and back to her desk. She said she had gotten distracted before sitting down at her laptop. I thought I saw a look of shock on her face for a split second, but she quickly hid it. She then mentioned something about losing track of time. Feeling incredibly weirded out, I told her I was heading home for the day without really waiting for her response. I didn't ask her about the ring because I had forgotten about it after finding her in that strange state. Later, at my hotel, I took the ring out of my pocket and threw it on the nightstand. Upon closer inspection, I saw it wasn't just a simple black band. It was made of many tight, individual metal fibers pressed together, looking pretty intricate. The next morning, I decided not to bother her about it. I wanted to avoid unnecessary interactions with her because of how strange she was. Plus, the degaussing machine hadn't been damaged. So I stopped by her lab, noticing the door was still green, so I didn't have to knock. I was right on time because, like I said, I wanted to minimize interactions. I had no plans to chat with her or anything like that. The room looked mostly the same when I entered. I noticed that although she wasn't at her desk, the networking device from the day before was gone, apparently installed. I didn't see her anywhere in the room, so I called her name. No response. I took a quick look around, peeking through the maze of hardware racks, but didn't see her anywhere. She was absent, so I figured she was just running late. I went off to continue my work from the previous day. I checked back in at both 9 and 10:30, but she wasn't there either time. Around 11, I had another box of old hard drives to degauss. As I opened the door to the staircase leading to the room, Mary brushed past me. She was wearing the same outfit as the day before, which I noticed for reasons that will soon become clear. I also noticed the same ozone smell that I had smelled before. It seemed to be coming from her, and I wrinkled my nose. There was a palpable tension in the air, like I was about to get a static shock. I looked at her, and she smiled normally, greeting me. I asked her where she had been all morning, and if she had been degaussing drives. She gave me a look like she had blanked out for a second, staring at me with a dull and bored expression before coming back to life. She told me not to worry about it, and I didn't push further. I started explaining what I'd be doing that day since she was my stand-in manager. She didn't seem to care much, just nodding passively. When I mentioned I was about to go start the degausser, she stopped me, raising her hand. Her face went dull and expressionless again before snapping back to normal. It was hard to explain. It was like she cut out for a minute. Then she asked me if I was messing with the degausser the day before. I said yes, and then she got really close to me, narrowing her eyes in a serious look. She asked sternly, in a monotonous voice, if I had taken anything out of the machine that wasn't mine. I'd like to say I'm not easily intimidated, especially by someone smaller than me, but she exuded this tension, anger masked by calmness. The metallic ozone smell was all I could smell. My mind went to the ring, but the way she was in my space made me think she might snap if I acknowledged it. So I told her, no. We stared at each other for a few seconds, maintaining eye contact, before her expression eased up. She cocked her head, still smiling, and asked in a friendly, upbeat tone, "Are you sure?" I knew I was lying through my teeth, but her sudden emotion swap made me want to end the conversation. I insisted I hadn't taken anything. To divert the focus away from the missing ring, I asked her what she was doing in the degausser's room. Rather than replying, she just smiled again, her face relaxing. She shrugged her shoulders and continued up the stairs, leaving me there. Only after she was gone did I realize I was sweating. Mary was bizarre. I couldn't understand her emotions. I wondered if she was struggling with mental health issues and whether she was fit to work in that condition. There wasn't much I could do about the situation. At my position, going to the senior tech and saying, "Hey, the lady you left to manage me is crazy," wouldn't go over well. So I bit the bullet, told myself to keep my head down, minimize interactions, and do what was needed to avoid being fired. I planned to return the ring, but felt that revealing it during that confrontation would have made her lash out. She looked so predatory. I planned to return the ring the next morning, placing it somewhere she'd be likely to find it. The day went by quickly. Each time I brought a new batch of drives to degauss, the pressure in the air and the ozone smell seemed to get worse. It extended outside the building too, but only around the two primary buildings, the degaussers and Mary's. I went to see her again later in the day, but the server room was empty. As weird as it was a relief. Back at my hotel, I put the ring in the pants pocket of what I planned to wear the next day, so I wouldn't forget it. The next morning, I arrived on site, parked, and headed in. For a better visual layout, there's a building directly in front of me, and to the left, the land rises to where the radar installation is, with Mary's server room at the base. Between those two is a clear stretch leading to the woods bordering the site, about 60 meters wide. The tree line wasn't far away. I could see to the end. It was really clear and visible. I tell you this to emphasize the following. I saw someone standing far at the edge, right in front of the trees. It was raining lightly that day, but they had no extra layers on, even from far away. I could tell by the identical clothes from the previous days and the color of her hair that it was Mary. She was standing, staring into the trees, not moving, no coat, just her blouse and skirt from before. I watched her for a minute, feeling weirded out, when I heard a yoo-hoo from my left. I turned and saw Mary again, or at least someone who looked like her but with different clothes, different top, bottom, and a lab coat. She was hanging out from the overhang of the building trying to get my attention. I looked at her, then back at the tree line where I thought she had been standing, but there was nobody there. I got a chill, noticing the smell from before was thick in the air. Mary called out to me again, asking if I was coming inside. I must have looked as freaked out as I felt because she asked if something was wrong. I just said nothing and followed her into her server room. As we walked, she started introducing herself, telling me about her history with the CAF and other stuff. I nodded along, confused. She confirmed my name and I said, "Yes, that's me." It was like, in her mind, it was our first interaction. She was friendly now, civil, professional, like a normal person. She caught on to how weirded out I was and asked if I was all right. After a breath, without mentioning that I thought I saw her in another place, I asked her why she had been so strange the past 2 days. She looked at me like I was stupid and asked what I meant. That's when I realized it. I looked at her closely. It was the same face, the same woman, but her hair was a good bit longer than before. In the past 2 days, it had been cropped back aggressively, but now it flowed past where her coat began. It was a small detail, but noticeable. Her face, too, it was slightly different, not like a change in makeup, but in the composition and angles. The more I looked at her, the more it became clear that she wasn't the same person I had met before. So, nervously, I asked Mary if it was her first day here, feeling really dumb while doing so. She told me she had been working here since last year, but she often came to the site before to manage the database array, which she was now planning to move. Before I could say anything else, she thanked me for starting to set up the new servers. It was the same task I had done with her, or rather, for her, 2 days ago. I felt silly, almost laughing, wondering what had happened in the past 2 days. Jokingly, but also seriously, I asked if she had a twin sister, and she said no. Asking me why I asked such a random question, I just shook my head, still confused. Mary then said she wasn't the type to control everything and told me I probably knew more about what I was doing than she did. She told me to get started and that she would be there if I needed anything. She was supportive and professional. All the weirdness from the Mary I had seen 2 days ago was gone. She sat down at her desk, and I noticed she didn't have her notebook. I thought about mentioning it, but then I realized I had the strange ring in my pocket. I placed the ring on her desk and asked if it was hers. She picked it up and looked at it before asking if she looked like a goth. Confused, I asked what she meant. She said the ring was ugly and she had never seen it before. She pointed out an engraved cross running nearly the entire length of the band inside the ring, which I hadn't noticed. She asked where I found it. Not wanting to say it was inside the degorser, I lied and said it was on the ground. She laughed, pushed the ring back towards me, and took out her laptop. I just stared at her, still confused by everything. She noticed and asked if something was wrong. Realizing I probably seemed like a creep, I quickly left. The air outside smelled horrible, much worse than before. It smelled like copper and sulfur, not just magnetism and ozone. It was gross and irritating. I looked over at the trees again, but saw nobody. I got back to work. There was only one building left on my list, and only 3 workstations. I brought a small cart to collect them all. The building was tiny, with a garage and a small office on one floor and 2 more offices upstairs. I went to the top floor. The station IDs on my list didn't say which floor each computer was on, so I had to look around. I found all 3 devices in a single room. Since my cart was downstairs and there was no elevator, I had to carry the workstations one at a time. The first 2 trips were fine, but on the 3rd trip, when I reached the top of the stairs with a computer in hand, I heard a laugh. It was like a dry, sick, grotesque heaving coming from the bottom of the stairs. I froze. The sound stopped as quickly as it started. There were no footsteps or other noises. I half expected to see a really sick dog when I got down there, but there was nothing. The cart and other computers were untouched. The smell from before, which was almost non-existent in the building, was now there, and it followed me. I brought the 3 workstations back, removed the drives, and took them to the degorser. When I got there, the machine was running, and the cycle finished seconds after I arrived. I opened it up, but there were no drives or rings inside. It had just been turned on. I felt weirded out, but kept working. I ran each drive through the degorser, trashed them in a special bin, and brought the machines back to my pallet. After wrapping it, I finished for the day and went to check in with Mary. Seeing her was still strange. She was nice, but the difference in her behavior was confusing. After I explained I was leaving, she got up from her desk and asked me to come with her. We walked through the maze of servers and stopped in front of an older piece of hardware. I realized it was the same device Mary had been at the day before when I found her in a trance-like state. I asked why she was showing it to me, and she grabbed something from the top of the hardware. It was the black leather-bound notebook. She laughed and told me to flip through it. She explained she found it tucked between 2 servers. The notebook was full of unintelligible scribbles. Each page was covered in ink, like someone was trying to darken every page with a pen. There were symbols cut out among the scribbles, but they were just simple shapes. It was nonsense. Mary found it funny and said it was the funniest thing she had seen in a server room. I might have found it funny too if I hadn't seen someone who looked like her clutching it a few days ago. The day ended, and I came back on Thursday. I was afraid Mary would switch back to the strange persona I had seen, but she was fine and pleasant. My work with the old machines was done, and I was waiting for the new ones to arrive. I told her I would help with whatever she needed. Her work, converting database schema from military jargon to something new, was beyond my skills, so I just talked with her all morning. I didn't mention the strange events because I didn't want to seem crazy, but the smell was still there in the server room, not strong but noticeable. I asked her about it, and she said she smelled it too, thinking there might be a thunderstorm soon. Around 11:30, nothing unusual happened. Mary sighed, stood up from her workstation, and said she was going to microwave her lunch. She invited me to eat with her. I agreed and went to grab my bag with my food. I remember the room got noticeably cooler for a moment as the door closed behind her. I picked up that strange smell again, stronger this time. I turned around with my food in hand and looked back at Mary's workstation. To my shock, she was sitting there, even though I had just heard her leave. But it wasn't the Mary who had just left. It was the version of her I saw on my first 2 days. She wore the same clothes and had shorter hair. She was slouched in the chair, eyes open and staring at nothing. It was bizarre. Hesitantly, I called out, "Mary," from across the room. She turned to look at me with the most lifeless expression I had ever seen. Her eyes were strange, like they didn't belong in a human face. They were sickly and out of place. There was a brief flash of movement like she was getting up from her chair. The next thing I knew, I was on the ground, on my back, the air completely knocked out of me. The only thing I could smell was that awful coppery stench. As I struggled to breathe, it filled my nostrils. When I finally got up, still unsure if I had been hit or if I had just collapsed, I felt sick. The room was empty. There was no sign of anyone else being there. Even the rolling chair was still, but the room stank. A few minutes later, Mary returned. I had intended to follow her to the kitchen, but that was now forgotten. She stood in the doorway, asking if I was coming. She joked that it smelled like one of the servers had caught fire. I should have said something, but I didn't. How could I explain that a doppelganger of hers had been in the room, that I had interacted with it on Monday and Tuesday? I didn't want to risk being sent home and possibly fired for mental health reasons. So I said nothing. I got up and looked at her, realizing she was so different from the thing I had seen. Yes, there were physical differences, but the real Mary had life and light in her. The thing I saw was vacant and void. I went to eat lunch with her, but just picked at my food. I tried to rationalize it as a delusion brought on by stress, but there was too much to explain. As I sat there, playing with my fork, I fumbled around in my pockets and found the black ring. I felt a wave of discomfort and excused myself, confusing Mary. I took the ring back to the Degorsa. The stairs to it were in the same building, close to the lunchroom, so Mary knew where I was going. When I got there, I put the ring into the tray. I couldn't explain why, but I felt a mix of wanting to get rid of it and trying to free myself from whatever was happening. I thought the Mary thing wanted the ring. So I started the degorsing cycle and left before it finished. As I turned, I saw Mary standing at the stairs. The real Mary. She had followed me and asked what I was doing, since she knew I had no discs left to scrub. I lied and said I was setting a maintenance cycle on the Degorsa. It was nonsense and she didn't buy it. She didn't say anything, but she knew I had been acting weird at lunch. She moved past me to the Degorsa, which was buzzing as it ran its magnetic cycle. When it finished, she crossed her arms and gave me a strange look. I didn't have the heart to tell her not to open the tray. She reached in and pulled out a ring, a plain silver ring. It was completely different from the black ring. The black texture and the cross were gone. It was bright, shiny, and looked like a simple wedding band. She flicked it at me, and I failed to catch it. Bending down to pick it up, I noticed it was cold to the touch, icy even. She joked that she didn't know I was married, and I stammered that it wasn't mine. She then told me not to put junk in the machine and left. Left with the cold silver ring, I put it back in the tray where I had found the black one. I shut the machine and left. The smell was gone, though I wasn't sure if it had been there during lunch. I headed back upstairs. Mary had already finished up. I looked out the kitchen window and saw her walking to the other building. She stopped for a second, looking across the gap between the buildings, down to the woods where I had seen her, or the other her, standing the previous day. Then she kept moving. It was odd, but I remembered it clearly. The rest of the day was uneventful. Mary was fine, working away. I just sat in the server room with her. We left for the day, and when we returned the next, a delivery truck arrived with the new assets I had to start deploying. I spent Friday setting up all the stations and physically placing about 8 where they needed to be. I checked in with Mary, and everything was fine. Then she asked me where the creepy notebook went. Confused, I asked what she meant. Apparently it was gone. She had gone to check it out, only to find it missing from the server rack where she had left it. The following week was uneventful. I didn't see anything strange. Once I returned to the Degorsa after finding an old, unlisted machine that needed to be junked. The ring was gone from the tray. It was a week ending, but since then I did some Googling. There are a few urban legends that intersect with this kind of thing, but nothing concrete. If the Mary from the first 2 days was something supernatural, there was some kind of intelligent intention behind it. Shapeshifters in legends rarely speak, let alone operate computers. Maybe it was an elaborate prank. I may never know. But missing closure isn't all that bad for my peace of mind. Story 2. Over the past few months, I've watched my brother Henry undergo a transformation that's both mysterious and unsettling. The cause, I believe, dates back to our childhood and a tree we discovered in the forest. It's important to me that you understand I'm not seeking judgment. I simply need to share this burden. Henry's behavior has become increasingly strange, and I fear it may have something to do with an experience we had when we were kids. We grew up in a house in Canada, nestled where the city meets the forest. Our home was surrounded by nature, and the woods were our playground. Autumn was especially magical, with leaves turning shades of gold and orange, carpeting the ground in a brilliant display. As children, Henry and I would spend countless hours exploring the forest, discovering its hidden treasures and making up games. One autumn day, when I was 6 and Henry was 10, we stumbled upon a tree that stood out from the rest. It was a giant, ancient tree, standing slightly apart from the others, as if it had claimed its own little circle. This tree became the center of our adventures. We made up a ritual where we'd gather fallen leaves, fashion them into crowns, and place them at the tree's roots as an offering. We imagined that the tree was our secret guardian, protecting us from any harm. Even when winter arrived and our visits to the forest became less frequent, our connection to the tree remained. To me, it was a cherished memory of childhood innocence. But for Henry, it seemed to mean something more profound. As we grew older, our visits to the tree dwindled. Life became more demanding, and we had less time for childhood games. However, we still made occasional trips to the tree, reminiscing about the simpler times we shared. When I turned 20, I had the opportunity to study abroad in France. I spent 3 years away from home, experiencing new cultures and meeting new people. While it was an incredible journey, I missed my family deeply, especially my parents and Henry. We stayed in touch through messages and calls, but it was never quite the same as being there in person. Upon my return, I noticed that everything at home seemed unchanged. The house, the yard, and even my parents looked just as they did before I left. Henry appeared the same at first, but there was one thing that caught my attention. His frequent visits to the tree had resumed with newfound intensity. Henry would leave our house at dusk twice a week and return long after dark. His hands were often dirty, and his arms bore small scratches. When I asked him about it, he would give vague answers, saying that he enjoyed walking at night. I found it odd, but I didn't realize then how deep his obsession ran. A turning point came when our mother fell ill. She was diagnosed with cancer, and our parents decided to move in with my aunt, who lived closer to a hospital that provided the best treatment options. Henry and I stayed behind, and that's when I began to notice even more disturbing changes in him. Henry had always been a calm and introspective person. He spent a lot of time in his room, playing video games or watching movies, but now he seemed even more withdrawn. He spent hours locked in his room or wandering in the forest. I knew he was visiting the tree more often, but I didn't think it was cause for concern. It seemed like he was just trying to hold on to a piece of our past. However, after our parents left, I started seeing the truly strange behavior. Henry's nighttime excursions became more frequent, and he no longer limited them to twice a week. Every night, at dusk, he would head into the forest and return at odd hours, often well past midnight. What troubled me most were the signs of his nocturnal activities. He'd come back covered in dirt, with scratches not only on his hands but also running up his arms. There was a strange, unidentifiable smell on him, a mix of wet soil and something metallic. Whenever I asked him about it, he brushed me off with nonchalant excuses, insisting that he was merely taking walks to clear his head. Initially, I tried to convince myself that he was telling the truth, but then something happened that made it impossible to ignore the situation any longer. It was a cold night, and I was awakened by the usual creaking sounds of our old house adjusting to the temperature. Feeling thirsty, I got up to refill my water bottle in the kitchen. As I passed by Henry's room, I noticed his door was ajar. That wasn't unusual, but the darkened room was empty. Henry wasn't home. My first thought was that he might have gone out for a late-night walk, but deep down, I knew he was in the forest. I decided to stay up until he returned. I turned on my computer and tried to distract myself, but every passing minute felt like an eternity. Finally, at precisely 3:33 a.m., I heard the soft sound of the back door opening and closing. That particular time of night always sent chills down my spine, reminding me of ghost stories I'd heard as a child. But I knew I had to keep an eye on him. The following night I stayed awake again, and sure enough, Henry left at dusk and returned at exactly 3:33 a.m. This pattern continued every single night that week. I couldn't take it anymore and decided to confront him directly. One evening, as he was preparing to leave, I told him I wanted to come with him. I expected resistance, but he merely laughed and agreed. "All right, brave one, but don't start crying halfway through, okay?" he teased. As we walked through the forest, Henry's playful demeanor seemed to return. He pointed out routes I could trip over and sometimes held my hand to guide me. "You're slower than I remember," he joked. "Maybe because you're a lunatic who comes out here in the middle of the night," I retorted. Despite the banter, the atmosphere grew tense as we approached the tree. Henry fell silent, and his expression became more serious. The tree stood there, unchanged, but now I noticed the meticulous care it seemed to receive. The bark was pristine, free from fungus or moss, as if someone tended to it daily. Around the tree I saw an assortment of items: leaf crowns, painted pine cones, hand-carved wooden trinkets, and even pieces of jewelry. It resembled an altar, a place of reverence and mystery. The more I looked, the more I realized that this tree held a deeper significance for Henry than I had ever imagined. It was not just a relic of our childhood games, it was something much more profound and perhaps even dangerous. That's when I knew I had to dig deeper into what was happening to my brother and the true nature of his connection to this enigmatic tree. "What is all this?" I asked Henry, looking at the strange items around the tree. "Just a way to keep things organized," he replied flatly, as if he didn't want to discuss it. I stood there for a while trying to understand, but in the end, it was just a tree, no matter how strange his care for it seemed. I decided to ignore it. Maybe I was being unfair, judging my brother's odd hobbies. For a few weeks, everything seemed to go back to normal, or at least I convinced myself it was fine. Henry kept going out at night, and I tried to get used to his peculiar behavior. Then something happened that changed everything. It was exactly midnight when I heard the back door open. I went to the living room and saw Henry coming in, but this time he looked different. His hands were covered in dried blood, and there was dirt all over his body, on his arms, legs, even his face. His clothes were filthy, as if he'd been crawling on the forest floor. "Henry, what happened?" I asked, trying not to panic. He barely looked at me. "I'm taking a shower," he mumbled, walking past me. I just stood there frozen. It was obvious something was very wrong. I waited until I heard the shower turn off, ready to confront him as soon as he came out. But before I could say anything, I heard his bedroom door lock. "Henry!" I knocked on the door. "Are you okay? Did you get hurt?" "Go to sleep," he replied, his voice muffled. He didn't sound angry, just exhausted, like he'd just endured the longest day of his life. I kept calling out, insisting, but he didn't respond again. Eventually I gave up and went to my room, but I couldn't sleep. The blood, the dirt, the silence, it wouldn't leave my mind. Something was terribly wrong, and I knew I wouldn't rest until I figured out what it was. This was just a few days ago, before everything got worse. At the time I didn't know what to think, but now, looking back, I realized this was the turning point. Maybe I should have done something then and there, but it's hard to act when you're not sure if you're losing your mind or not. Here's what happened. Henry had left the house in the middle of the afternoon, as he usually did, saying he was going for a walk. Nothing out of the ordinary, but I was still stewing over everything that had happened. The dirt, the blood, the strange way he acted around the tree. So, while he was out, I decided to check his room. I know it sounds invasive, and I did feel bad about it, but I needed answers. As soon as I opened the door, a strange smell hit me. It was a mix of wet soil and iron, like the metallic scent you get when you cut your finger. It was strong and seemed to grow worse the longer I stayed in there. The first thing I noticed was how the room looked normal from the outside, but once inside, nothing was actually clean. The curtains were drawn as always, but up close, I could see they were stained with dirt. In the corners of the room, the floor had small, dark stains that I didn't want to think about. Then I opened his bedside drawer, and that's when things got truly bizarre. Inside, there was an old, crumpled piece of paper smeared with dirt. It looked like it had been ripped out of a school notebook, and it was written in crayon, in a way that clearly resembled a child's handwriting. What did it say? Something like, "I promise to be nice to the tree." The strangest part was the signature. He had used his thumbprint, and around it was what could only be dried blood. At the time, I tried to rationalize it, like, okay, this is just kid stuff, a silly game he never threw away. But why was it still there, and why was it smeared with blood? I didn't have much time to think about it. I heard the front door opening. Henry was back. I closed everything as quickly as I could and left his room, trying to look casual. When he walked into the kitchen, his pants were dirty with soil as usual, but otherwise, nothing seemed out of the ordinary. He grabbed a glass of water and looked at me with that goofy smile of his. "Everything okay?" he asked, as if absolutely nothing strange was going on. I stared at him, trying to decide whether or not to ask. In the end, I just said, "Yeah, fine. Cool, I'm going to take a shower." And that was it. He left the kitchen, and I stayed there, completely lost, with 1,000 questions racing through my mind. Later that same night, that's when things got truly weird. I was in the living room, trying not to think about anything, when I heard heavy footsteps on the porch. I went to the window and saw Henry standing outside. He was holding what looked like a wooden amulet, and he was singing. I couldn't understand the language. It sounded made up, but there was something about it that didn't sound normal. It was deep, almost echo-like. And then he stopped. Slowly, he turned his head in my direction, like he knew I was watching, and he smiled. A smile that was utterly bizarre, accompanied by an even stranger growl. After that, he simply turned and walked away, heading toward the tree. I knew that was where he was going. At that moment, I didn't know what to think. Now I know that wasn't just in my head. A few days have passed, and things seem to have only gotten worse since then. The house is constantly dirty with soil in the corners. Henry spends hours and hours away from home, and the creaking of the floorboards always starts up at night. I keep hearing the sound of the shower running, and when I'm in the living room or kitchen, I can hear my brother singing in that strange language. I swear on everything holy, I've seen him smiling in that creepy way out of the corner of my eye, but every time I look directly at him, he's back to normal. I don't know if it's some kind of prank, but it's starting to get seriously disturbing. After that night when I saw Henry standing outside and looking at me with that eerie smile, I tried to ignore it. I pretended everything was fine and went on with my life. But the truth is, that image was stuck in my head, along with all the other strange things that had happened. This morning, I finally gave in. I called our parents. They dodged the topic as usual, but one comment kept echoing in my mind. My mum said something about how the tree was our special place, and how after I left, Henry became obsessed with it. According to her, he spent hours there, alone, as if trying to relive the memories of our childhood. I don't know why, but that made me feel guilty. I decided to put the thought aside for now. After hanging up, I decided I needed to talk to him, lay everything out in the open. But before I could leave my room, I saw something out of the corner of my eye. On the doorway threshold, there was a trail of blood. Not a lot, but enough to freeze me in my tracks. I followed the trail to the living room, and that's when I noticed the smell. Wet earth and something metallic, strong, almost unbearable. The blood led to the front door. When I opened it, I saw a perfect circle of salt around the house, and the strangest part, there was a line of coarse salt stretching across the yard through the grass, disappearing into the forest. I don't know why, but I just knew it led to the tree. Before I could make any decisions, I heard a loud bang from the back porch, as if something had slammed into the house with immense force. And I wasn't wrong. When I got to the porch, I saw a deer. It was smashing its head against the glass door over and over again, leaving bloodstains every time it hit harder. What the heck was that? I'm no expert, but that definitely isn't normal anywhere. What the actual heck? The deer kept smashing its head into the glass until it broke and fell forward, collapsing like a rag doll. The deer was dead, not because it had smashed its head into the glass so many times, but because its stomach had been ripped open, as if some beast had torn it apart and left the remains to rot. I threw up, a lot. Can you blame me? There was a dead deer in my kitchen that somehow looked like it had been decomposing for months. I was done. No, I was exhausted. I couldn't take it anymore. I didn't know what kind of twisted nightmare this was, but it had to end. I had to put a stop to it. I grabbed my phone and a hatchet hanging on the wall in the living room, and I marched into that cursed forest, heading straight for that damn tree. I knew it was all the tree's fault. I could feel it. So I was going to cut the problem at its root, literally. I'm not sure how to explain what happened next. My hand was shaking so much that I almost dropped my phone while following that trail of coarse salt. It was already strange enough that the salt was there, but the blood that seemed to mix along the way made my stomach turn. There was no logical explanation for it. The trees around me seemed more alive, or maybe more dead, as if they were sucking something out of the earth. The roots were everywhere, intertwining like pulsating veins. With each step, the air grew denser, almost sticky. When I finally reached the tree, I almost didn't recognize it. It was surrounded by a circle of salt, lit by candles that flickered despite there being no wind. There were animal bodies, rabbits, birds, even a dog, arranged around the trunk like a macabre offering. There was something deeply wrong about it all, but before I could process everything, my eyes landed on Henry. He was kneeling in front of the tree, murmuring something. I think he was praying. His hands were clasped together, fingers stained red and covered in dirt. Even from a distance, something felt different. Henry had always been thin, but now he seemed elongated, as if his body no longer fit the normal proportions of a human. His clothes were covered in dried blood and mud. My instinct was to run, but my legs wouldn't obey. I hesitated. That was when I made the worst decision possible. I took a step forward and stepped on a dry twig. The sound was like an explosion in the oppressive silence. Henry immediately stopped praying. For a few seconds, there was no sound, just that unbearable silence. Then he laughed, first softly, almost like a whisper, but the sound grew louder, becoming something inhuman. He slowly stood up, almost mechanically, and turned to face me. I almost vomited. Henry was smiling, but it wasn't a normal smile. It was too wide. His teeth looked bigger and sharper, and his eyes. God, his eyes. The whites of his eyes were overtaken by black veins, and his pupils were so dilated they covered almost the entire iris. He looked happy to see me, as if this was the most anticipated reunion of his life. You arrived, just in time, he said, his voice hoarse, but with an almost childish tone. We can do the ritual together, like we used to. My body froze. Then I realized he was talking about those stupid games we played when we were kids, pretending to talk to the tree like it was a guardian or something like that. It was just a game. At least that's what I thought. Henry, what is this? What the hell is going on here? I asked, trying to sound firm, but my voice came out shaky. He didn't respond immediately. Instead, he tilted his head to the side, still smiling. You abandoned me, he suddenly said, the smile disappearing. His voice came out loud, almost a shout. You left me here alone, and I prayed every day for you to come back. The tree talked to me. It listened when no one else did. I gave my prayers, confessed my sins, and it rewarded me. It brought you back. I took a step back. Henry had never spoken like this before. He had always been too playful to get angry. I couldn't even remember the last time he yelled at me. Now it seemed like all the repressed anger was coming out at once. Henry, you're scaring me, I tried to say, but he interrupted me. Scaring? I should be scared. You have no idea what I've been through here, alone with her. But now it's okay. We're together again, and we just need to renew the contract. That's all. He started walking toward me slowly, the macabre smile returning. "You'll understand. You'll see. The tree is good. She loves us. We can do rituals together, make offerings like we used to." I had no idea what was going on, but hell no, I wasn't going to be part of this sick thing. I raised my axe and threatened Henry. It was me or him. Even if I had to go through my brother, my goal was to cut down that tree. "Henry, back off. I'm not joking. I'm going to end this, and you'll go back to normal," I yelled, hoping he would hear me, but he didn't stop. When he started walking toward me with that smile that seemed more and more inhuman, I didn't know if fear or anger was stronger. Henry was unrecognizable. The playful boy who always followed me like a puppy was now this deformed figure, his voice carrying an authority that should never belong to him. I tried to argue, to say that this wasn't him, that we needed to leave, but he just laughed. "I'm not going anywhere. I can't. Not after everything I've done for us. You'll thank me. You'll see, it's going to be fun, just like old times." That's when he lunged at me. I don't know if he meant to hurt me or just hold me, but instinct is a powerful thing. My hands found the axe I had brought just in case, but he was too fast. Henry grabbed my arm before I could fully react, and his fingers were so strong I felt him tearing into my skin with his nails. Blood started flowing down my wrist, and the pain brought me back to reality. This wasn't my brother. I shoved him with a force I didn't know I had, knocking Henry, or whatever this thing was, to the ground and grabbing my axe with both hands, ready to strike back. "You think you can stop me? You think you can undo what the tree has given us?" he shouted, his black eyes locked on mine. That's when I saw my chance. I used all the strength I had and swung the axe. He tried to dodge, but I was done with all of this. The axe hit his shoulder and he screamed, but the sound wasn't human. It was something deeper, almost like the wind howling through the tree roots. The next strike was definitive. His head was no longer part of his body. The blood flowing into the earth was proof of that. I swear I could hear him grunt even after I struck his neck with the axe. And then, silence. I stood there frozen, with the axe still in my hand and my brother's body in front of me. But it didn't end there. I needed to put an end to this. I approached that damn tree, ready to use the lumberjack skills my own brother had taught me. But the voices started as a whisper, but soon became deafening. It was hard to tell what they were saying, but all the words pushed me toward the tree. I saw faces in the shadows, figures that weren't there. I could swear I saw the tree's roots moving, trying to grab me, like a mother's warm embrace. I knew I needed to get out of there. I couldn't fight it. Something wasn't right. It was just a matter of cutting down the tree, and everything would end, but why did I feel like it was so wrong to do that? I dropped the axe right there, but I'm not stupid enough to wait for something to happen. I ran like never before. I didn't look back as I stumbled on the way back to the house, heading toward the car, my hands still covered in my own blood. I got in the car, slammed the door, and only when I turned the key did I realize I was shaking so much I could barely drive. Even so, I took a deep breath and didn't hesitate to start the car, leaving as fast as I could. The whole way, I could hear whispers, so many whispers. I drove for a long time until I found a cheap motel on the side of the road. I definitely wasn't going to sleep there, but it was either that or risk a car accident. Honestly, I don't know how they let me into the motel all covered in blood. I just know I don't have much time, and I'm trying to write all of this down before it's too late to warn as many people as possible. Because I can hear my brother's laugh in the midst of the voices, and when I looked at myself in the mirror, I saw something in my eyes, something that shouldn't be there. If anyone is reading this, I beg you, burn that tree. Story 3. I grew up in a house near a forest for most of my life. Imagine all the scary stories I've heard that kept me awake at night. My father grew up in Michigan, in the Algonquian lands, and he had so many stories to tell. My mother always scolded him for scaring me. "For Christ's sake, Gerald, you'll scare the poor boy out of his wits," she would say. But he never seemed to listen to her. Despite the fear, I always felt connected to the forest. As a kid, I wondered about the stories the trees might have seen and how many moons and sunsets they witnessed. I used to sneak out at night to sit in a treehouse I secretly built. I knew my father wouldn't allow it. One day, I overslept in the treehouse, and my father found it while looking for me. He was very angry. When I asked why he hated the woods, he said, "When you've seen what I've seen, you'll understand soon enough." I never understood what he meant. Now, 7 years after my father died, I was driving my car through the Appalachian Trail. I started to understand his words. The forest at night was really creepy. It was pitch black outside, and the clock on my dashboard showed 12:54 a.m. The faint blue glow of the clock was my only comfort besides the car's headlights. The trees on both sides of the road looked like skeletal limbs reaching out with claws. My headlights lit up patches of cracked pavement and occasional road signs covered in grime. The silence was oppressive. It wasn't the peaceful quiet of the wilderness, with crickets and rustling leaves. This silence was dense and heavy, like a blanket smothering everything. The only sounds were the low hum of the engine and the occasional crack of a branch under the tires. I glanced at the rearview mirror but saw nothing but darkness. I swore under my breath, regretting my sister's visit. She had forgotten her breast pump at my place, and since her house was so remote, I had to bring it to her. I had never taken this trail before, even though my father often talked about his heritage and experiences in the woods. I tried to distract myself by turning on the radio, but it was just static. I kept turning the channels aggressively, but there was nothing, just static. Suddenly I saw movement on the road ahead and slammed on the brakes. The car skidded to a halt with a screech. I swore again. What the actual... There was a deer standing in the middle of the road, or at least I thought it was a deer. It was a buck, tall and thin, with antlers like twisted branches. Its ribs were visible through its fur, and its legs looked too long and fragile. The headlights cast eerie shadows on it. For a moment I thought it was sick or starving, but then it looked at me. Its stare pierced through me like a human's gaze. I gulped, remembering the countless legends my father had told me. Sweat started forming on my neck. The forest remained silent and still. No crickets, no rustling leaves, not even a twig snapping. Its eyes didn't reflect light like normal animals. They absorbed it, pulling me deeper into darkness. I sat frozen, gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. The fear was overwhelming. The creature tilted its head slowly, unnaturally, as if trying to understand me. I covered my mouth with one hand, but it didn't break eye contact. Then it moved. Its legs jerked forward in a puppet-like motion, bending in unnatural ways. My eyes widened. You don't have to be an expert to know deer don't move like that. The creature opened its mouth, and a low, guttural clicking sound filled the air. It wasn't a sound any deer should make. Panic, fear, and outright rage surged through me, and I hit the horn. I hit it again and again. The loud sound echoed through the silence, but the creature didn't flinch. It tilted its head again, almost as if it was playing with me. Its spindly mouth turned into a smile, and I watched in horror. It took another step forward. "Nope, nope, nope, nope," I muttered, slamming the gear into reverse, but the car wouldn't start. "Fuck! Fuck!" I yelled and pressed the accelerator again. The headlights flickered once, twice, and then the road plunged into darkness. When the lights came back on, the road was empty. The deer had vanished. My heart was pounding like a drum in my chest as I pressed the accelerator and sped forward. "Just a weird deer," I whispered to myself, though my mind didn't believe it. I tried to push those thoughts away. That's all it was, just a sick deer. Bah. But the knot in my stomach didn't go away. The road stretched on, darker and narrower, the trees closing in like a tunnel. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. Maybe something was. My hands tightened on the wheel as the car hit a pothole, the jolt rattling my teeth. A sharp crack echoed through the night. "Shit!" I swore again, this time louder. I paused. Now that the sound of my car had stopped, I noticed just how quiet the forest was. I glanced in the rearview mirror again. For a moment I thought I saw movement, something pale darting between the trees. The knot in my stomach tightened. I shook my head. "Keep it together," I muttered. "You're just tired." From fear, my legs now felt like lead. But then it happened again. This time I was sure of it. A shape, pale and long-limbed, slipping through the trees just at the edge of the headlight's reach. The car suddenly felt like a fragile bubble, a thin shield against the encroaching darkness and the ever-approaching dread of the forest. I pressed the accelerator harder, the engine growling as the car got out of the pothole and finally sped up. I prayed to God to save me. I wished all this would just end as quickly as possible. But no matter how fast I went, the thing in the woods kept pace. I could see it now, flickering in and out of view, darting between the trees with unnatural speed. My chest tightened as the road twisted and turned, the headlights sweeping across the wilderness. Every curve revealed more shadows, and every shadow felt alive. Even the branches seemed to be watching me. And then the engine sputtered. "No, no, no," I muttered, my voice trembling as I slammed the gas pedal. The car lurched forward before stalling completely. The headlights dimmed, and the silence returned, heavier than before. I fumbled with the key, twisting it in the ignition. The engine groaned but refused to start. And then I heard it. The clicking sound, that guttural sound that deer, or whatever it was, had made. It started faint, a rhythmic, bone-chilling noise that grew louder with every passing second. It was coming from the woods, circling the car, closing in. My breathing was shallow as I peered out the window, the darkness pressing against the glass. My breath had fogged the window, and then I saw it. The creature stepped into the beam of the dying headlights. My breathing became faster as it walked on its hind legs. Its body contorted and stretched, the thin fur barely clinging to its frame. The antlers jutted out at unnatural angles, and its eyes, those hollow, black pits, seemed to pierce through me. It opened its mouth, and the clicking sound turned into a low, guttural growl. My hands shook as I turned the key again, desperate. The engine roared to life, and I slammed the gas pedal. The car jolted forward, the tires spinning on loose gravel before catching traction. The creature lunged, its bony hand slapping against the rear window with a sickening thud.